One of the things that we're trying to wrestle with the idea of having, a site community about Bold Cup of Coffee is looking at this idea of healthy dialogue, healthy and helpful dialogue. So for both you guys, Paul and Randal, can you just, when you think about that idea of healthy and helpful dialogue, what comes to mind in your conversation with people in the different fields that you've been in and stuff?
First word that comes to mind is disagreement. So we think often one of the reasons people are afraid of dialogue is because we might end up disagreeing. And you sort of think disagreement's a bad thing. We all need to come to a common consensus at the end of everything. But I think disagreement is part of the fact it's just a reality that we aren't going to come into agreement. And even in those disagreements, we can learn a lot. So I think that's one of the reasons we have dialogue is because we disagree and we're going to learn from the other. And we don't have to be afraid of that.
Anything, Paul?
Usually when I think constructive dialogue, I think the word empathy the most and putting myself in the other person's position and perspective and at least trying to understand from whatever perspective they come from how they're relating to the question at hand or how they're processing the dialogue. What might their worldview be affecting how they read the question that's different than my own? So I find that I typically have to walk in their shoes a bit, understand where they're from, as well as empathy in a sense of seeing them just valued as a person. Because often we tend to vilify those we disagree with. And if we could just view them as, this is someone who I love, this is my neighbor, this is my friend, and even if they are your enemy, well, Jesus tells us to love them. And so it's empathy, I think, is the heart of good conversation.
So talking about walking in somebody else's shoes, at what point, I've had some conversations with differing people, and some people that do that well, some people that do. One of the examples that I was really, I don't know if I'd taken back or impressed with was, it's somebody that I know, he's like a brother-in-law of somebody that I know, things like that, but he writes a blog on the defense of head covering. So he's a pretty conservative, has, very traditional conservative perspectives, but the way that he goes about interacting with people is probably one of the best that I've ever seen. And it's usually not, I would say, characteristic of maybe a person in that camp that is very, very traditional or very conservative, very fundamental in his things. But he even wrote a point about trying to understand another person's perspective. And even as he delivers his points of view, it's always just been, this is what I hold, this is the conviction I've come to, and I'm going to present it, you take it or leave it. So I was very impressed with this idea of you need to really, if you're going to interact or even challenge somebody's perspective, you need to first understand, like we said, what they believe. So with that in mind, where do we find that balance? Because obviously you can, if I'm interacting with somebody, say, from a different faith or different belief system or just even a different tribe inside of our own belief system, you can sit there for decades trying to better understand what they're trying to say. So where do you find that balance between disagreeing and also empathy of when do you engage, or even if you are going to engage maybe prematurely, what are the type of things that you want to bring into that conversation to be able to have fostering, I guess, dialogue?
Well, dialogue has two people at least in it, and that means it's two ways. And so one of the things is half the time you should be quiet and be listening. And I think sometimes we just want to get our point across, and you'll shut up long enough to let the other person say what they think is important, and then you can get back to what's really important.
Yeah.
And people can tell if you're a good listener or not. And so if you're not going to extend the courtesy or the hospitality of listening to other people in a genuine way, in an open and vulnerable way, and an empathetic way, then they're not going to probably listen to you, and it's going to be an abortive conversation from the beginning.
I would also add to that if I'm able to restate their position in a very generous way, I find that's helpful for dialogue. So whatever the issue is, if I'm able to sum up and capture what they're presenting so they feel I'm faithful to what they've brought to the table, there is that mutual understanding that they're not being disregarded, they're being heard, the person is being empathized with, the person is having their voice ring true. And also it shows, as you said, like being a good listener. Like how do we listen in such a way as to, add to and to explain and to try to find mutual ground. That's kind of where I'm going with that. So,
yeah. So one of the conversations I had recently with somebody was trying to wrestle with the idea, even too, as you're listening with somebody, as we're dialoguing, we've looked at this idea of like allowing somebody to listen, but also too, you're assimilating information you're hearing what somebody's saying. So I think to truly listen to somebody is also to willing to give validity to the point that they're making. So one of the things too, like in an interview that we had a roundtable conversation previously with Dr. Trench and Michael Harding, and and one of the things that Martin Trench had said too is like when you're looking at somebody else's perspective, and they're presenting an idea and it actually has grounds to it. It may not fit into the paradigm or the box or whatever that you had before, but you're looking at what they're saying going, I can't just dismiss that person outright anymore, or shouldn't have in the first place. So where would you, I think, looking at that balance too of also like, as I'm listening and I'm taking information going, that's a really captivating or interesting thought. Now I'm taking that information. How do I find that balance now also between accepting something but also being critical of it, so that where that balance between giving space to learn from somebody, but also recognizing too that we need to be critical about what we take in, so we're not just like as James says, just going back and forth like a wave of the sea type of idea. So how do you find being respectful and empathetic and compassionate and listening and giving time for that person to speak, but also going, okay, I want to learn from this person, but I also need to know what I should be taking, what I shouldn't be. Like, what are some tools or things you've used?
Well, I would just start with saying from the perspective of epistemology or a theory of knowledge. We talk about beliefs being rational, and you can recognize a person's belief as rational, which means essentially it is a belief that a reasonable person could hold in light of the evidence or experiences on which this person holds the belief. You could recognize that a belief is rational without agreeing with the person.
Yeah.
And that's just a starting point. So we don't have to feel like there's a whole space between this person's nuts and I agree with this person.
Yeah.
And that space is what we need to cultivate, is to say, okay, now why does this person hold the beliefs they do? How can I come back to empathy? How can I understand why they're holding those beliefs rather than just writing them off? And in my podcast, I interviewed a little while ago a young Earth creationist. And I don't hold the view of young Earth creationism, but I listened closely to what this person has to say. He was a representative of Answers in Genesis. And I wasn't any more persuaded at the end of the conversation of his position, but I understand why he holds his position, and perhaps I understand it a little bit better than I did before after that conversation. And that's just what we need to be willing to do, is to extend people the courtesy, try and understand where they come from, and recognize their beliefs probably are rational, because I think most of our beliefs are fairly rational, even if we don't agree with everyone.
I think you summed it up great.
There you go. A couple things that are going in my mind as you guys are talking about empathy and understanding, and also being rational or using reason. An author, Greg Kokel, talks about a book called Tactics. And one of the things he talks about is like, in a conversation, you need to have two things. Being charitable or having charitability. That's where the empathy, not attacking the person, discussing their point of view. And just being all around a normal human being. And like you had said, viewing that person as a human being. And then at the same time, also looking at the sense of like it being rational, having a certain amount of reason that's involved in that. So when you're interacting with a person who either doesn't show rational thinking or a sense of reason, or leaves the bounds of being a charitable person, is there a way to interact with that person? Like, at what point do you find that it's just like, do I just need to, cut tie, or just cut my losses into this conversation? There
is a point where you're going to have to agree to disagree on certain things. I mean, there are different things here. One degree is emotional hostility. So, I mean, it's one thing for you to believe that a person really is persisting in an irrational course of thought. It's another thing if they're also going to be emotionally hostile toward you. And if it's the latter case, then probably further conversation at this point, at least on that topic, is not going to be helpful. But if you think they're irrational, but they're still open to dialogue and to reflection, then I think you can keep the lines of communication open. And you just have to discern the openness of the person toward continuing to rethink their views. But also, you continuing to rethink your views, because maybe your assessment is off. I know a lot of atheists, for example, that I interact with think I'm irrational.
Yeah.
And I think they're wrong, and I hope that they keep the lines open so that they can rethink their assessment of my beliefs, and likewise me for them.
I would also add too that I find that a lot of the dissension, a lot of the conflict is when we begin to challenge people. Not so much that we would say that they're irrational, but maybe even inconsistent. Like I find, especially within conversations, maybe just within our own Christian umbrella with fellow Christians, often I find it is when we're challenging each other, well, how could that be consistent? And yet not finding a common footing to see how they could perhaps be internally inconsistent. I mean, it's not that I would ever call someone irrational, let's say if they're a Calvinist, but am I at least putting myself in the Calvinist position, and trying to empathize with them, but also just maybe bring some of the evidence that I would bring, because I kind of grew up more within an Arminian kind of perspective, and I mean that's the classic Christian disagreement that most people have, and that's been going on for 500 years almost, since the Reformation, and I'm not sure if we've had any progress. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting too to even just recognize that there is disagreement. I think that becomes one of the things too where, it's that, and I quoted Brad Jerzak in an earlier roundtable, but it was just that idea of like the church as a whole. He was convinced that the church as a whole is not going to go into great heresy because we have these differing perspectives, right? And it's when we isolate ourselves further and further and further from these differing perspectives, even outside of Protestantism, and even Orthodox or Catholicism, and just recognizing that we can learn different things and they hold differing traditions that were passed down and things that they can bring to the table and stuff like that. But just what's been interesting to me also too is that there's also been this sentiment of like you'll listen to somebody who's very forward in the way that they present, you you hear the challenge of like how effective has that been? They want to challenge the person, and the response has always been, it doesn't matter if it's effective or not, it matters if it's true or not. And one of the things that's put me on a journey for myself that has been really interesting is recognizing, it doesn't end right there, right? Because I've had people who've had to try and explain to them, like, having conversations, be it online or in person or whatever, and then especially when it was this instance specifically, I was online having this conversation and just trying to like have a conversation, just coming back very much matter of fact and those sort of things. And I was getting these private messages saying, I love to interact in the conversation, but I'm scared of this person, and I had to relay to them later going, you have a lot of good things to say. You have a voice and you have something to be able to impact the church, but people they're beginning and starting more and more to not listen to you anymore because of the manner and the way that you do it as well. Yeah. So I think that becomes a huge distinction as well of like not only how we hold our views, like having those convictions, having confidence, having assurance in those things, and being able to present those things, not having to be fearful of saying, I have a very strong view and I'm going to challenge you with it, and balancing that with not having utter certainty, but also in the manner, like we talked about charitability and empathy, and looking at like, when if we have a disagreement, Paul, and I go, I'm not just going to be a jerk about it and just go, you're going to hell because, or just you're an idiot, or just how dare you because it doesn't fall into my idea. And I wonder how much of that too is like, I think somebody had said it earlier too, is like when they're that emotional reaction because their perspectives are they feel attacked, right? Because, well, if you're disagreeing with me, I don't have, you know, my personhood is attached to my belief system.
Yeah, that's a very important point. A lot of people get life from their set of beliefs, and when you challenge that set of belief, you're striking right to the heart of who they are as a person. And I don't know when personally to always know when I'm doing that. Like when I'm having a conversation, often when you know this, you've already crossed the line. When you let's say you're just deconstructing a thought system, and that thought system set of beliefs is related to that person. And they react in such a violent way, or just a hostile way. That's when you know you've crossed this personal attachment line. But how do you know? Like how do you know not to? Because it's only when you're in dialogue do you discover this.
Well, you certainly have to be attuned to body language. And I mean, one thing you'll find is when conversations sort of go off the rails, people start speaking faster and they speak louder. Say they go into the fight or flight mode, and if they're not running away, then they're ready to fight. And so we have to be intentional when conversations begin to get heated about stepping back, about making sure you modulate your voice, that you don't respond in kind by raising your voice, that you don't respond quickly, that you're continuing to think and take things in and speak in a less confrontational tone. I mean, I like watching police officers trying, when they're successful at de-escalating a situation, you know, they'll talk a person down, they speak calmly to the person, and we need to do that similarly. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. I mean, you're right, like sometimes people just feel they're under attack and they're threatened. And I mean, another way to do it is to present points in that offhand way, indirectly, so that it's not taken as a direct attack at them, but they can draw out the implications that this point has for their belief system without feeling they're in the spotlight.
Let me ask a question for you, Randal, specifically. Do you think, again, in the many interactions you had being in apologetics or even in your writings and things like, or even just in teaching, when somebody is reacting like that and you're realizing that they've attached their particular belief system to their identity, is there a manner in to be able to disattach or separate those things and helping a person recognizing that, or even in the conversation to disattach emotion or identity to that particular belief system? Have you found?
I mean, one tool as a general observation to try to get an audience on your side is to be self-deprecating. And as much as you raise criticisms for any other individual or any other belief system, you are turning it back on yourself as you go along. Because it's much more difficult for people to get angry at you when you're allowing for those little comedic interludes where you're saying, yeah, but look at me. And then they don't feel as threatened, and they realize that you're making yourself vulnerable. And I found that to be really helpful. And it's a good reminder as well to myself along the way to be reminded myself that I don't have everything correct.
Well, this has been good. Thank you guys for showing up and willing to be part of this conversation. So, I think just as a closing thought, just to look at this idea too, when we think about this idea of dialogue, or anybody who might be watching this video, I think that we could all be in agreement. I mean, I think even, and as the three of us probably agree on more things than we disagree with, but even in this state, even just recognizing this, that, it'd be interesting to see how far the rabbit hole goes, and if we were to pick certain topics and recognizing what areas of disagreement. But like I said, I think if we can all go into conversations, one with a certain amount of reason, a certain amount of empathy, but also just coming at the table of none of us have all these things figured out, that we can learn from somebody who might even be drastically different. I guess they could probably spend their time just talking about with the people that you've interacted with, even with atheism, and looking at, well, I still disagree with that, but I have to at least give credit where credit's due, or be willing to go, that puts, I have to think about that, I have to wrestle with that now. And so, as we continue moving on into dialogue, I think going into those conversations with a certain amount of humility and openness, while at the same time being willing to, both sides having the freedom to be able to discuss those things. So thank you guys for this.
Thanks. I think it was a very good conversation.
Yeah.
So good
dialogue.
A lot of empathy.
A lot of empathy.
Empathy all around.